Hello. Today's presentation will touch upon BWDA's local monitoring, as well as provide some additional guidance on what is necessary to consider at the local level as you embark on monitoring your subrecipients. By the end of this training, you should have a better understanding of BWDA's latest request for information pertaining to fiscal integrity and local board monitoring, and the purpose of collecting the information, what gets reviewed during BWDA's LWDB monitoring review, requirements of LWDB monitoring of its subrecipients, and reporting and resolution requirements. First, we'll start out with the CWDS online monitoring activity released on March 1st, 2025. It's the last formal document request which comes from BWDA as part of Oversight Services Program Year monitoring. It covers local monitoring, fiscal integrity, audits, and case file reviews. This period also covers both desk and on-site monitoring requirements. Let's discuss fiscal integrity. The term fiscal integrity can take slightly different approaches and areas of greater focus depending on whether the purpose is auditing or monitoring. For the purpose of Oversight Services Monitoring Review, fiscal integrity covers proper internal controls, cost allocation, and the cost principles, like whether costs are reasonable, necessary, allowable, and allocable. First, BWDA requires a listing of all WIOA expenditures for PY 2024 from July 1st, 2024 to current. This includes, but is not limited to, programmatic, administrative, direct and indirect, shared and cost-pooled costs and expenditures using WIOA formula funds and any WIOA-funded discretionary grants. Oversight analysts will select expenditures ranging from routine payments for things like rent to less routine costs being checked for compliance with cost principles. The oversight analyst will review this list and select checks for further review during the on-site visit. The number of checks selected depends on the overall number and types of expenditures identified. During the on-site review, Oversight will use its check review worksheet to collect information related to the check and the supporting documentation about the expenditure, including how it traces back to the request for funds. While on site, Oversight will have fiscal agent staff walk through the tracing process and must be able to see how an expenditure traces to a specific FSR and RFF, even in situations where cost pooling exists. Second, Oversight reviews copies of completed statements of financial interest forms for LWDB staff directors and any fiscal agent personnel responsible for reviewing and approving the expenditure of funds. Third, Oversight is requesting all timesheets and payroll documentation, including time distribution as well as annual salary for local board staff for December 2024 and January 2025. Oversight reviews this information to ensure proper time and cost allocation and compliance with regulatory salary caps. Fourth, Oversight is requesting the local board complete and submit a copy of the PY 2024 Separation of Duties Worksheet. This is to ensure proper internal controls to avoid administrative conflicts of interest in the local fiscal system. Local boards should use the template found in CWDS as it is the most up-to-date version when completing it. Finally, Oversight requests a copy of the most recent completed single audit. This is to ensure any findings identified on the audit have been resolved, as unresolved findings may have an effect on an LWDB's certification. Also in the documentation request are items needed to review the local board's monitoring of its subrecipients. Requested items are a copy of the local area's current local oversight plan and completed subrecipient risk assessment, copies of completed monitoring tools, reports, and corrective action plans resolution reviews for the monitoring of WIOA Title I programs, including formula-funded activities, activities using WIOA discretionary funds, and specialized WIOA-funded National Dislocated Worker Grant programs. This includes any monitoring of ITA providers and OJT employers. Third, copies of completed monitoring tools, reports, and corrective action plans/resolution reviews pertaining to the certification of each PA Career comprehensive site, affiliate site, and/or specialized center, including mobile service sites within the local area. Fourth, copies of completed monitoring tools, reports, and corrective action plans/resolution reviews for the monitoring of the one-stop operator and its performance. Fifth, blank copies of any relevant monitoring tools not used to monitor the local workforce system in PY 2024. Some monitoring worksheets that we had previously requested to be completed by the local areas are now reflected in the CWDS activity questions. These questions in activities 4A and 4B must also be completed by March 21st, 2025. A note about local monitoring. Documentation from any of the PY 2024 monitoring will be performed by a local area between the due date until June 30th, 2025, must be submitted to BWDA no later than Tuesday, July 15th, 2025 at noon. This will allow Oversight Services time to meet its monitoring and reporting deadlines for the organizations which monitor L&I. This is not currently enshrined in policy, however, it is determined to be necessary to keep up with compliance obligations and requirements. Local areas should plan their local monitoring accordingly to avoid compliance findings or concerns. In Section 1, we identified the local monitoring items needed to be submitted to BWDA. But here's some additional items about BWDA's local board monitoring review process. BWDA reviews the local board's monitoring plans, tools, and local policies for compliance with applicable federal and state statutes, regulations, policies, and guidance. This is to ensure local boards are identifying areas of noncompliance and practices that, if left uncorrected, are likely to lead to noncompliance. It's also to ensure that these results are reported and provided to the monitored subrecipient, and documented steps are undertaken until the compliance issue is fully resolved. Let's talk quickly about some of the common causes of findings Oversight Services identifies while monitoring local board monitoring. Local boards should ensure they're documenting their reviews of missing contract amounts, comprehensive identification of the types of services being provided and scope of work, a complete list of the 14 youth elements, child abuse clearances review, work permits for minors, and parental permission for minors under 16 that are working. Remember, if it's not on the monitoring tool, oversight can assume it's been monitoring, and findings may be the result. Similar to the requirements BWDA uses to ensure local boards are properly monitoring their subrecipients, there are also requirements of local boards as they monitor their subrecipients. Local monitoring always starts with a good foundation. Local boards may choose to adopt oversight and monitoring policy, like L&I's, which outline the local board's monitoring methodology. However, a monitoring policy isn't required. What is required is a local monitoring plan. Unlike a policy, the monitoring plan is a living document and must be updated at least annually to address the required elements of the plan. These elements include a description of the local oversight process, addressing what the local board will monitor, how it will be monitored, how often monitoring must be occurred based on a required risk assessment, and the schedule and timeline for all monitoring activities in the current program year. Those are the required elements. However, local boards may choose to add additional monitoring factors and criteria not required by L&I's oversight and monitoring policy to its plan. A big part of the local monitoring process revolves around risk assessment. The goal of the risk assessment is to inform local boards of the need for additional monitoring to mitigate risk or determine the continued suitability of a provider. This slide lists the minimum criteria by which subrecipients must be evaluated. The local board may impose additional risk factors. The risk assessment must use a well-defined, supported point value scoring system, which must be consistently applied amongst all subrecipients. Subrecipients must then be identified as low, medium, or high risk, which each category must correspond with a particular course of action. This course of action may be no additional action for low-risk providers, and additional monitoring or voluntary or mandatory technical assistance for those with an elevated risk status. Types of oversight to be incorporated into local areas monitoring includes: first, it's administrative oversight, which must be completed at least once per program year. This includes, but is not limited to, local governance, local plans and agreements, local board compliance and certification, PA Career Link certification criteria compliance, and PA Sunshine Act compliance. Next is programmatic oversight. Monitoring of these elements must be conducted at least quarterly. Again, this includes, but is not limited to, program management and standards, program policies and procedures, service delivery, participant eligibility, subrecipient monitoring activities, supportive services and needs-related payments, youth activities, and data element validation. Finally, fiscal oversight and monitoring. At a minimum, each of the following items must be monitored at least once during the contract period. The frequency of monitoring will depend largely on the results of the local risk assessment. Providers with a lower risk level may only need the minimal frequency of monitoring, which is that once per contract period, while those with an elevated risk may require more frequent monitoring. All these elements of monitoring should be clearly reflected in the local area's monitoring tools and corresponding monitoring reports. Finally, there's one-stop operator monitoring. The one-stop operator must be evaluated at least annually and must include the OSO contract provisions, the results of participating partner surveys, and other performance measures developed by the local boards. To close out this section, here's a summary of some of the required elements of the local monitoring plans. BWDA highly recommends local boards conduct subrecipient monitoring as early and as often as is required and is practical. This is to ensure fiscal and case file issues are caught early to avoid continuing a practice which could theoretically lead to additional noncompliance, a higher amount of question costs, or continued case file issues. Please see L&I's Oversight and Monitoring Policy for additional monitoring frequency requirements. Finally, we're going to discuss the reporting and resolution requirements. The local board monitor must provide a copy of the oversight report to the monitored entity. The oversight report must identify issues of noncompliance and provide recommendations for corrective actions. A written timeline for completed corrective actions must be identified. There must be periodic reports from service providers outlining monitoring reviews, noncompliance issues, and the status of corrective actions. Ensure that a briefing regarding oversight activities and findings is provided to the local Workforce Development Board at regularly scheduled meetings, and that the briefing is documented. Perform an annual evaluation of the oversight function to determine its effectiveness, and develop the written oversight process to be used in the provision of oversight. Local boards must have a written policy in place that describes the entity's appeals process, which must include, at a minimum, timelines, levels of appeal, requests, reviews, adverse and favorable determinations, and resolutions. The required local appeals policy must be consistent with the process outlined in L&I's sanctions policy. Remember, the reporting and resolution process must be in writing to ensure a sufficient audit trail. While providing technical assistance is a valuable part of the resolution process, if the results aren't memorialized in a written report with documented steps the provider took to resolve an issue, when L&I or the U.S. Department of Labor comes to monitor the local monitoring, it may not show the hard work undertaken by the local monitors in identifying and correcting issues. This presentation, including all the resources, will be added to the BWDA Media Library on the L&I website for your future reference. If you're attending the live session, please feel free to put any questions you may have in the chat, and we'll respond to as many as possible. If you're viewing this presentation after the session and have any questions, please direct them to the BWDA Oversight Services resource account above, or contact the assigned analyst for the local area. Again, thank you for your time and attention.